The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the Akagi, as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood watching his pilots prepare for what many believed would be Japan's final crushing blow to American naval power in the Pacific. It was early June 1942, and the memory of Pearl Harbor's devastating success still burned bright in the minds of every Japanese naval officer. Yet beneath the confident exterior, a subtle unease gnawed at the edges of their certainty. 6 months had passed since that fateful December 7th attack that had catapulted America into World War II. The Japanese combined fleet, under the strategic vision of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had executed a masterpiece of tactical surprise that left the United States Pacific Fleet crippled. At its Hawaiian base, battleships Arizona, Oklahoma, and California lay at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, their hulks serving as tomb markers for over 2,000 American sailors and airmen. The victory had emboldened Emperor Hirohito's war cabinet and convinced them that their strategy of rapid expansion across the Pacific was not only feasible but inevitable. From the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific like a tsunami of steel and fire. The Philippines fell after General Douglas MacArthur's desperate defense, forcing him to flee to Australia with his famous promise to return. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress in Southeast Asia, crumbled before Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 25th Army in what Winston Churchill would later call the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Dutch East Indies, with their precious oil resources, had fallen like dominoes. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day 1941. The Burma Road, China's crucial supply lifeline, was severed. Japanese submarines prowled the California coast, shelling oil installations and spreading panic among American civilians, who suddenly realized that their homeland was no longer safe from enemy attack. Historical context drawn from At Dawn We Slept by Gordon Prange, which provides comprehensive documentation of Pearl Harbor's strategic implications. By spring 1942, the Japanese Empire controlled an area spanning from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the edge of Australia in the south, from Burma in the west to Wake Island in the east. It was the largest maritime empire in human history, achieved in a mere 6 months of lightning warfare. American morale had plummeted to depths not seen since the darkest days of the Civil War. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration faced mounting pressure from Congress and the American public, who demanded to know how their mighty nation had been so thoroughly humiliated. Yet Admiral Yamamoto understood what many of his colleagues chose to ignore. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical triumph but a strategic failure. The attack had united American public opinion behind the war effort with a fury that surprised even him. More critically, the American aircraft carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga had been at sea during the attack, preserving the core of American naval aviation for future battles. The Japanese war machine, despite its spectacular victories, was beginning to show signs of strain. Extended supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Industrial capacity, while impressive, could not match America's vast manufacturing potential once fully mobilized. Most dangerously, Japanese naval codes, which had served them so well in the war's opening phases, were beginning to show vulnerabilities that American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Hawaii were slowly but systematically exploiting. As Nagumo's task force steamed toward what would become the most pivotal naval engagement in Pacific history, neither side fully understood that the age of battleship dominance was ending, and that the upcoming battle would be decided not by the thickness of armor or the caliber of guns, but by the skill of pilots, the accuracy of intelligence, and the ability to break the enemy's most closely guarded secrets. In the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph John Rockford hunched over a stack of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions, his eyes burning from hours of staring at seemingly meaningless combinations of letters and numbers. The 42-year-old cryptanalyst had been working around the clock since late April 1942, convinced that the Japanese were planning something massive, something that could determine the entire course of the Pacific War. Rochfort's Combat Intelligence Unit, known as Station Hypo, had been steadily chipping away at the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code for months. Unlike the diplomatic Purple Code that had been broken before Pearl Harbor, JN-25 was the operational cipher used by Japanese fleet commanders to coordinate their movements and battle plans. Breaking it was like trying to solve a crossword puzzle where most of the clues were missing and the language was foreign. The breakthrough came when intercepted messages began repeatedly mentioning a target designated AF. Rochefort's team had identified references to what appeared to be a major Japanese offensive operation involving virtually every capital ship in the combined fleet. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, needed to know where AF was located, and he needed to know quickly. Rochefort had a theory. For weeks, Japanese communications had included references to water shortages and supply difficulties at AF. The pattern suggested an isolated outpost, somewhere that would require extensive logistical support for a major operation. His intuition pointed to Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of land 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii that served as an advanced American base. To confirm his suspicion, Rochefort proposed an ingenious deception. He convinced the Midway garrison to send an uncoded radio message, reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Within 24 hours, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message stating that AF was experiencing water shortages. The puzzle was solved. Yamamoto's target was Midway. Intelligence Operations detailed in And I Was There by Rear Admiral Edwin Layton, which chronicles the crucial role of code breaking in Pacific theater operations. But knowing the target was only part of the equation. Rochefort's team had to determine the timing, the composition of the attacking force, and most critically, the Japanese plan of battle. Working with fragments of intercepted transmissions, they slowly pieced together the scope of Yamamoto's ambition. Operation Me, as the Japanese called it, was not simply an attack on Midway. It was a carefully orchestrated trap designed to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle where they could be destroyed once and for all. Yamamoto's strategy was typically complex and elegant. The first carrier striking force, under Nagumo's command, would approach Midway from the northwest and pound the atoll's defenses with 2 waves of bombing attacks. Meanwhile, the main body, led by Yamamoto himself and the massive battleship Yamato, would remain several hundred miles to the west, ready to engage any American fleet units that responded to the attack. The plan's genius lay in its assumption that American commanders would react predictably. Faced with the loss of Midway, Admiral Nimitz would be forced to commit his remaining carriers to save the strategic outpost. When the American ships arrived, exhausted from high-speed transit and caught between Nagumo's carriers and Yamamoto's battleships, they would be annihilated. To ensure success, Yamamoto had assembled the most powerful naval force in Japanese history. For fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu formed the heart of Nagumo's striking force, embarking over 150 of Japan's most experienced pilots. Supporting them were 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The invasion force, under Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, included 12 transports carrying 5,000 troops to occupy Midway after its defenses were neutralized. Yet as Rochefort studied the intelligence picture taking shape on his plotting boards, he began to understand that Yamamoto's elaborate plan contained a fatal flaw. By dividing his forces into multiple groups separated by hundreds of miles, the Japanese admiral was violating one of naval warfare's most fundamental principles: concentration of force. If American commanders could position their ships correctly and strike at the right moment, they might be able to defeat the Japanese forces piecemeal. The question was whether Admiral Nimitz would trust the intelligence enough to risk his entire remaining fleet on what many of his subordinates considered an elaborate Japanese deception. Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood on the flag bridge of his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, studying the intelligence summary that would determine whether the United States Navy lived or died in the Pacific. The 57-year-old Texan had inherited command of the Pacific Fleet after its devastation at Pearl Harbor, and now he faced the most critical decision of his naval career. Every instinct honed by 37 years of service told him that Commander Rochefort's intelligence was accurate, but the stakes were so enormous that a single mistake would hand the Pacific Ocean to Imperial Japan for a generation. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. After Pearl Harbor and the subsequent carrier raids across the Pacific, Nimitz could muster exactly 3 operational fleet carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown had limped back to Pearl Harbor from the Battle of the Coral Sea, with massive structural damage that Navy Yard estimates suggested would require 3 months to repair. The Japanese, by contrast, were bringing for carriers with experienced aircrews who had been honing their skills since the China War began in 1937. Captain Miles Browning, Admiral William Frederick Halsey's chief of staff, voiced the skepticism many felt. "Admiral, if we're wrong about this intelligence, we'll be sending our last carriers into a trap. The Japanese could be feeding us false information through their own radio deceptions." Similar doubts echoed through the halls of the Navy Department in Washington, where Admiral Ernest Joseph King, Chief of Naval Operations, worried that the Pacific Fleet was taking an enormous gamble based on incomplete information. But Nimitz had learned to trust Rochefort's methodical approach to intelligence analysis. The cryptanalyst had correctly predicted Japanese moves during their recent operations in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. More importantly, the pattern of Japanese communications showed all the hallmarks of a genuine major operation: increased radio traffic, movement of fleet units, and the positioning of supply vessels. Decision-making process documented in Nimitz by E.B. Potter, detailing the Admiral's leadership during critical Pacific theater operations. The decision to commit everything to defending Midway required Nimitz to override decades of naval doctrine. Traditional fleet tactics emphasized concentration of battleships in decisive engagements, with carriers providing supporting air cover. But the Pacific War had already demonstrated that aircraft carriers were the new capital ships, and battleship versus battleship engagements were becoming obsolete. At Midway, American victory would depend entirely on the skill and courage of naval aviators, flying from pitching flight decks hundreds of miles from their target. Nimitz made his choice on May 27, 1942. Enterprise and Hornet, under the tactical command of Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, would depart Pearl Harbor immediately and take position northeast of Midway. Yorktown, her flight deck hastily patched and her hull reinforced with concrete and steel beams, would follow under Rear Admiral Frank "Jack" Fletcher's command. The repairs that should have taken months were completed in 72 hours, through the heroic efforts of 1,400 shipyard workers laboring around the clock. The American plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its risk. Fletcher and Spruance would position their carriers approximately 200 miles northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese search aircraft, but close enough to launch decisive strikes. When Nagumo's carriers began their attack on the atoll, American dive bombers and torpedo planes would strike the Japanese ships, while their aircraft were refueling and rearming for the second wave. Against Midway, everything depended on timing and luck. If the Japanese discovered the American carriers too early, Nagumo could launch a full strike against Fletcher's ships before they could attack. If the American pilots failed to find their targets in the vast expanse of the Pacific, the strike forces would run out of fuel and be forced to ditch in the ocean. Most critically, if Rochefort's intelligence was wrong and the Japanese were actually attacking somewhere else entirely, the American carriers would be steaming toward empty ocean while the real Japanese offensive succeeded elsewhere. Nimitz understood that he was betting the future of American naval power in the Pacific on the accuracy of cryptanalysis and the skill of aviators, most of whom had never participated in a major fleet engagement. As Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor on their rendezvous with destiny, the Admiral could only wait and pray that his gamble would not result in the destruction of the last effective American naval force in the Pacific theater. Dawn on June 4, 1942, broke clear and bright over the Pacific as Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron adjusted his goggles and checked his instruments aboard his Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber. The skipper of Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet understood better than most that he and his 14 fellow pilots were flying obsolete aircraft into the teeth of the most powerful carrier force the world had ever seen. The Devastator, once the pride of American naval aviation, was now painfully slow and vulnerable compared to the swift Japanese Zero fighters that would soon be climbing to intercept them. At 0600 hours, Japanese radar operators aboard the cruiser Tone detected the first American search planes probing toward Admiral Nagumo's first carrier striking force. Nagumo, confident in his four carriers and experienced aircrews, had already launched the first wave of attacks against Midway. Atoll, 108 Japanese aircraft Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, Aichi Val dive bombers, and escorting Zero fighters were streaking toward the tiny American outpost to begin the systematic destruction of its defenses. The timing could not have been worse for the Japanese. At the moment when Nagumo's strike aircraft were pounding Midway's runways and installations, his carriers were at their most vulnerable. Flight decks were cluttered with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for the anticipated second wave. Gasoline lines ran across the hangar decks, and ordnance was stacked in ready rooms. Aviation fuel vapors hung heavy in the tropical air, creating a floating magazine that could be ignited by a single enemy bomb or torpedo. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's Air Group 6, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours when he spotted the destroyer Arashi racing northward at high speed. The Japanese warship was hurrying to rejoin Nagumo's formation after dropping depth charges on an American submarine, and McCluskey correctly deduced that following the destroyer's wake would lead him to the enemy carriers. Pilot experiences documented in the first team by John Lundstrom, which chronicles naval aviation operations during the early Pacific War. What McCluskey saw when he crested the cloud layer at 14,000 feet would haunt Japanese naval commanders for the remainder of the war. Spread across the blue Pacific in perfect formation were all four of Nagumo's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. Their flight decks were packed with aircraft being prepared for the second strike on Midway. Fuel lines connected bombers to the ship's aviation gasoline systems. Ordnance crews were wheeling torpedoes and bombs from magazines to waiting aircraft. The Japanese had been caught in the worst possible tactical situation. Their combat air patrol of Zero fighters was flying low cover, having just finished shooting down Lieutenant Commander Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8. All 15 American torpedo planes had been destroyed, with only one pilot surviving the slaughter. The sacrifice of Waldron and his men, however, had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the upper altitudes undefended against McCluskey's diving Dauntless bombers. At 0925 hours, McCluskey gave the order that changed the course of the Pacific War. Attack 37 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown plunged toward the Japanese carriers in the steepest dives their pilots had ever attempted. The Dauntless, unlike the obsolete Devastator, was a superb warplane, rugged, accurate, and capable of carrying a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb that could penetrate a carrier's flight deck and explode deep within the ship's vitals. The first bomb struck Akagi at 0926. Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best's 1,000-pounder punched through the flight deck near the after elevator and detonated in the upper hangar deck among fueled and armed aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship as aviation gasoline ignited and spread fire throughout the carrier's interior spaces. Within minutes, Admiral Nagumo's flagship was transformed from the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy into a blazing inferno. Simultaneously, bombs from Yorktown's bombing Squadron 3 devastated Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's attack was so precise that 3 bombs struck the carrier within 30 seconds, turning her flight deck into a twisted mass of steel and flame. Kaga, the largest of the Japanese carriers, suffered similar destruction as Enterprise dive bombers scored multiple direct hits that set off sympathetic explosions throughout the ship. In the space of 5 minutes, 3/4 of Japan's elite carrier striking force had been reduced to burning hulks. The carefully planned Operation Me was dissolving into chaos. As the survivors of Nagumo's once proud fleet struggled to fight fires, rescue shipmates, and preserve what remained of their combat capability for the inevitable American follow-up. Attacks. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Hiryu, watching the smoke columns rising from his sister ships as they burned on the horizon. The 51-year-old naval aviator understood that the fate of the Japanese Empire now rested on his single surviving carrier and the 18 remaining aircraft of his strike group. As the only undamaged ship in Admiral Nagumo's once mighty first carrier striking force, Hiryu had become Japan's last hope for salvaging victory from the catastrophe that had engulfed Operation Me. At 10:40 hours on June 4th, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Aichi Valdive bombers and 6 Zero fighters off Hiryu's flight deck in a desperate counterstrike against the American carriers. Kobayashi, one of Japan's most experienced dive bomber pilots, had participated in every major Japanese naval operation since Pearl Harbor. His orders were simple but daunting: locate the American fleet and inflict enough damage to even the odds for the remaining Japanese surface forces. Converging on the battle area, the American carriers had not escaped unscathed from their morning triumph. Yorktown, already weakened from battle damage sustained at Coral Sea, had been struck by 3 bombs from Kobayashi's attack group. The explosions had knocked out her radar, started fires throughout the ship, and reduced her speed to 6 knots. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, his flagship crippled and communications disrupted, transferred tactical command of American forces to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise. Spruance, a former cruiser commander who had assumed carrier group leadership only when Admiral William Halsey fell ill with dermatitis, now faced the most complex tactical situation in naval aviation history. His intelligence officers reported that at least 1 Japanese carrier remained operational, capable of launching additional strikes against his damaged ships. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto's main body, including the massive battleship Yamato with her 18-inch guns, was racing eastward to engage the American fleet in a surface action. Tactical analysis drawn from Incredible Victory by Walter Lord, which provides comprehensive coverage of Midway's complex battle phases. The afternoon phase of the Battle of Midway became a deadly game of hide-and-seek across thousands of square miles of Pacific Ocean. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, launched from cruisers and battleships, searched frantically for the American carriers, while Spruance's remaining dive bombers hunted for Hiryu. Both sides understood that the first to locate and attack the enemy would likely determine the battle's outcome. At 2:45, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Adams found Hiryu steaming northward at high speed, her flight deck crowded with aircraft being prepared for a second strike. Adams' 13 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise represented the last effective American attack force, their crews exhausted from hours of combat flying over the trackless Pacific. As they rolled into their attack dives, Adams and his pilots knew they were attempting to deliver the knockout blow that would decide the Pacific War's trajectory. The attack on Hiryu demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of American dive bombing tactics perfected through months of training and combat experience. For direct hits transformed Japan's last operational carrier into a flaming wreck within minutes. The explosions destroyed the ship's steering capability, set off secondary fires throughout her aviation fuel systems, and killed hundreds of crewmen in the hangar and flight deck areas. Captain Kaku, trapped on his burning bridge as flames consumed his ship, made the agonizing decision to abandon Hiryu, rather than see more of his crew perish in a futile effort to save the doomed vessel. As Japanese destroyers moved alongside to rescue survivors, Kaku remained at his post, determined to follow the samurai tradition of accepting responsibility for his ship's loss. The captain would die with his vessel when Hiryu finally sank early the next morning, taking with her Japan's last hope for carrier-based victory at Midway. By late afternoon, June 4th, Admiral Yamamoto faced the unthinkable reality that his carefully crafted operation had resulted in the complete destruction of Japan's elite carrier striking force. For fleet carriers, over 100 aircraft and thousands of experienced pilots and aircrew had been lost in a single day of combat. the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, painstakingly built over 2 decades of preparation, had been shattered beyond repair by American pilots flying from 3 hastily assembled carrier groups. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Without carrier-based air cover, Yamamoto's invasion force could not approach Midway in daylight without facing devastating attacks from American land-based bombers. The entire operation, conceived as the decisive battle that would eliminate American naval power in the Pacific, had instead handed the initiative to Chester Nimitz's forces and marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat toward the home islands. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood alone on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato. As radio reports confirmed the destruction of his carrier striking force, the 58-year-old architect of Pearl Harbor felt the weight of personal failure crushing down upon him as he contemplated the magnitude of Japan's defeat. In a single day of combat, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost more carrier aviation capability than it could rebuild in 2 years of intensive construction and training. The numbers told a story of unprecedented naval catastrophe for fleet. Carriers representing over 40% of Japan's total carrier strength had been sunk along with their entire air groups. More critically, over 100 experienced pilots had perished, men whose training had begun in the mid-1930s and who represented the elite of Japanese naval aviation. These pilots could not be quickly replaced, as American industrial capacity was already producing new aviators at rates that Japanese training programs could never match. Yamamoto's strategic dilemma had become impossible. Approaching Midway with his remaining surface forces would expose them to devastating attacks from American land-based aircraft during daylight hours. Admiral Spruance's carrier groups, though reduced in strength, remained capable of launching additional strikes that could cripple the invasion fleet. Most ominously, intelligence reports suggested that American reinforcements, including additional carrier groups, were racing toward the battle area from Pearl Harbor and the West Coast. At 0 to 15 on June 5th, Yamamoto transmitted the coded message that ended Japan's dreams of Pacific domination. Operation Me is cancelled. All forces retire to base. The decision represented more than tactical withdrawal. It marked the strategic turning point where Japan shifted from offensive expansion to defensive consolidation. The initiative in the Pacific War had irreversibly passed to American hands. Strategic Impact analyzed and shattered sword by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, which examines Japanese perspectives on the Midway defeat. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, the pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and who now lay wounded aboard the hospital ship while his comrades died at Midway, would later write that June 4th, 1942 represented the day Japan lost the war. The assessment, though made with hindsight, reflected the terrible arithmetic of carrier warfare in the Pacific. Japan had begun the war with 10 fleet carriers. America possessed 7. After Midway, Japan retained 6 operational carriers, while America, despite losing Yorktown, had gained the USS Wasp and would soon commission the Essex-class carriers that would dominate Pacific operations through 1945. The Japanese High Command's response to Midway revealed the depth of their strategic confusion. Rather than acknowledge the defeat and adjust war aims accordingly, military leaders chose to conceal the extent of their losses from both the Japanese public and Emperor Hirohito himself. Surviving pilots from the carrier strikes were isolated on a remote base and forbidden to discuss their experiences. Official communiques claimed that American losses had been severe, while minimizing Japanese casualties. This deception would prove even more catastrophic than the original defeat. By refusing to acknowledge Midway's implications, Japanese leaders continued pursuing aggressive operations that their depleted forces could not sustain. The Guadalcanal campaign, launched just 2 months after Midway, would consume additional pilots and aircraft that Japan could not afford to lose. Each subsequent defeat made recovery more difficult and ultimate victory more impossible. Emperor Hirohito, though shielded from Midway's full implications by his military advisors, privately began to question whether Japan could achieve its war objectives. Palace records, released decades after the war's end, reveal that the Emperor asked increasingly pointed questions about American industrial capacity and Japan's ability to replace lost ships and aircraft. The confident predictions of quick victory that had characterized the war's opening months gave way to sobering assessments of prolonged conflict against an enemy whose strength was growing daily. Yamamoto himself understood that time now favored America. In private conversations with trusted subordinates, he expressed doubt that Japan could win a protracted war against American industrial might. The admiral who had warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months in the Pacific had seen his prediction prove accurate almost to the day. After Midway, Japan would never again launch a major offensive operation in the Pacific theater, and the long, grinding retreat toward the home islands would begin in earnest. Commander Joseph Rockford sat in his basement office at Pearl Harbor, studying the after-action reports that confirmed his intelligence analysis had been devastatingly accurate. The cryptanalyst who had broken Japanese naval codes and predicted Operation Me felt no satisfaction in being proven correct. The cost in human life had been too terrible for celebration. Yet he understood that the Battle of Midway represented more than tactical victory. It marked the moment when superior intelligence and code-breaking capability had decisively influenced the outcome of modern warfare. The battle's aftermath revealed the true scope of Japan's strategic defeat. Beyond the loss of 4 irreplaceable carriers and their experienced air groups, Operation Me's failure had exposed fundamental flaws in Japanese strategic thinking that would plague their war effort through its conclusion. The assumption that American morale would crack under sustained pressure had proven false. The belief that Japanese tactical superiority could overcome American industrial advantages had been shattered by the reality of modern naval combat. American losses, while significant, demonstrated the resilience that would characterize their Pacific campaign. Yorktown had been sunk, along with the destroyer Hammond, and 150 American aircrew had died in the battle. But these casualties, grievous as they were to the families affected, represented replaceable assets in America's expanding war effort. The naval shipyards at Newport News, Brooklyn, and Mare Island were already laying down new carriers that would dwarf anything Japan could construct. Admiral Chester Nimitz's post-battle assessment captured the strategic transformation that Midway had accomplished. Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. Vengeance will not be complete until Japanese sea power has been reduced to impotence. The measured tone of his statement reflected the professional understanding that Midway had shifted the initiative but not ended the war. Ahead lay 2.5 more years of brutal fighting across thousands of Pacific islands before Japan's final surrender. Long-term implications discussed in Eagle Against the Sun by Ronald Spector. Examining the Pacific War's strategic evolution, the intelligence triumph that had made American victory possible at Midway continued paying dividends throughout the remaining war years. Japanese faith in their code security had been so completely shattered that they never suspected American cryptanalysts were reading their most sensitive communications. This intelligence advantage would prove crucial during subsequent operations at Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and Light Gulf, where American commanders possessed detailed knowledge of Japanese plans and dispositions. For Japan, Midway represented the end of the strategic offensive that had begun with Pearl Harbor. The combined fleet's surviving units would spend the remainder of the war in increasingly desperate defensive actions, trading space for time while American forces advanced inexorably toward the home islands. The pilot shortage that began at Midway would worsen with each subsequent engagement, forcing Japan to commit inadequately trained aviators against increasingly experienced American. The turning tide, Japan's forward strategy undone by Midway's tactical advantage and code.